All right. Good afternoon, y'all. Hope you all had a good long weekend, restful weekend, and ready to hit this week running. We have a lot of stuff for you this week. As usual, please keep your mics muted, and we can go and start. So this morning, as you probably saw, the Secretary General spoke at the opening event for the Virtual Counter-Terrorism Week. He said that it is too early to fully assess the implications of COVID-19 on the terrorism landscape. But, he added, the pandemic has highlighted vulnerabilities to new and emerging forms of terrorism, such as the misuse of digital technology, cyberattacks, and bioterrorism. Mr. Guterres highlighted 5 areas to guide our action, and he called on the international community to keep up the momentum in the fight against terrorism, as well as to closely monitor evolving threats, trends, and to be innovative in our responses. The Secretary General went on to say that counterterrorism responses must always be gender sensitive and protect and promote human rights. He also said that we need to tackle the spread of terrorist narratives through pandemic-sensitive, holistic approaches. And finally, he said we need to strengthen the information sharing to learn from the experiences and good practices of other COVID-19 security landscape. His full remarks have been shared with you, and the virtual counterterrorism events continue all week, and there'll be a briefing this week at our briefing by Mr. Voronkov, who heads the counterterrorism division here at the UN. And this morning, the Secretary General also spoke by video message at the integration segment of the Economic and Social Council, also known as ECOSOC. He called on governments, civil society, the private sector, development partners to accelerate coordinated global action to ensure that we recover better from the pandemic and deliver together on the promises of the 2030 Agenda. The Vice President of ECOSOC, Ambassador Mir Margayan of Armenia, said the implications of the pandemic have gone beyond the health sector, affecting all sustainable development goals, and realizing that decades of action and delivery for sustainable development will depend on our policy choices and resolve to act together. And as a reminder, tomorrow is the start of the UN's high-level political forum on sustainable development, which will go on until the 16th of July under the theme Accelerated Action and Transformative Pathways, Realizing the Decade of Action and Delivery for Sustainable Development. Turning to Syria, my humanitarian colleagues tell me that we continue to reach millions of women, children, and men in urgent need of humanitarian assistance throughout Syria. On average, each month in April and May, some 3.2 million people were supported from within Syria, and 1.3 million people were supported through cross-border operations from Turkey. With 2.8 million people in need and 2.7 million internally displaced people, needs for those in northwest Syria remain incredibly high. We have significantly increased the aid delivered via cross-border operations into the area, but much more is needed. Since the beginning of this year, 8,486 trucks have crossed into Syria from Turkey. That includes 1,579 trucks in June alone. As highlighted in the Secretary General's recent review of cross-line and cross-border operations, a sustained, large-scale cross-border response is necessary to meet the enormous humanitarian needs of the people in northwest Syria. And from Nigeria, our humanitarian coordinator there, Edward Cologne, condemned last Thursday's attack by armed groups in Damask in Borno State. At least 2 civilians, including a 5-year-old child, were killed and several others were injured. A UN humanitarian air service helicopter was hit, sustaining serious damage. Mr. Cologne stressed that the damage to the helicopter severely impacts the ability of aid workers to provide urgently needed assistance to vulnerable people in remote areas across Borno State. We, along other humanitarian organizations, are working to bring life-saving assistance to 7.8 million people in crisis-affected areas of the states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, many of them in remote areas. The UN Humanitarian Air Service is essential to evacuate wounded civilians and remains the backbone of facilitating humanitarian access. In 2019, the Humanitarian Air Service transported in Nigeria more than 66,000 passengers and nearly 150 megatons of humanitarian cargo. It also carried out 30 medical and 70 security evacuations. Mr. Cologne called on all armed groups all on parties to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to ensure protection of civilians, humanitarians, property, and personnel. Returning to COVID, and to give you a couple of updates about what our colleagues are doing in the field. In the Dominican Republic, where more than 37,000 confirmed cases of the virus and nearly 800 deaths have been reported, our operations there are led by resident coordinator Mauricio Ramirez, and the UN team has been supporting the government response on all fronts. The UN Children's Fund has provided 12 ventilators for local hospitals, while UNAIDS is working to ensure that people living with HIV continue to receive antiretroviral drugs. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program have organized a virtual training on vegetable farming for young people to generate additional income. WFP has also provided food assistance to more than 11,000 children under the age of 5, pregnant women and older people, and those living with HIV. The UN team has donated thousands of masks to organizations supporting people with disabilities and to government staff working with migrants, including those on the border with Haiti. The UN is helping to plan the socioeconomic recovery process, and this includes reopening of schools with UNESCO and UNICEF, together with the Ministry of Education, designing psychosocial support programs for children on the impact of COVID-19. And in Malawi, we, along with our partners in collaboration with national authorities, have been scaling up the response to fight the pandemic and protect the country's 18 million people. Almost all districts in the country have been affected, with over 1,400 cases reported. Since March, a risk of communication and community engagement campaign has reached more than 15 million people. With our support, Malawi now has 41 testing centers and 6 isolation and emergency treatment centers. More than 4.8 million units of essential supplies for fighting the pandemic have been mobilized. These includes testing kits and personal protective equipment for health workers and other frontline providers. We, along with our partners, have also been giving training to health workers and community facilitators. And since June, the UN Humanitarian Corridor has been operating in Malawi, bringing into the country critical relief and humanitarian personnel. We've also been supporting emergency education with radio programs, 6 million primary school students, and digital learning for more than 15,000 secondary school students. Our peacekeeping missions are continuing their support to governments and communities in response to the pandemic. The UN mission in South Sudan organized a 2-day workshop for community leaders and business owners in Wau and Jor River counties to spread messages on preventing the spread of COVID-19. Together with the Interfaith-Based Council for Peace Initiatives in Western Equatorial State, the peacekeeping mission has launched an awareness campaign at the Masia market, one of the most populated parts of the town of Yambio. And in Darfur, the Joint African Union UN mission handed over the newly constructed Justice and Confidence Center in Krinding camp for internally displaced people. This is near the town of El Geneina in West Darfur. This center aims to improve law enforcement and justice institutions in the camp, as access to justice remains one of the most key protection challenges in Darfur, especially during the pandemic. As part of its response, the combat to the spread of COVID-19 and the mission has distributed hygiene materials and dignity kits to internally displaced women at a site for internally displaced people in Sartoni in North Darfur. And in other news, just a brief update from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where according to a UN investigation, attacks by the ADF, the armed group also known as the Allied Democratic Forces, have left more than 1,000 people dead and dozens injured. And this is over the past 18 months. The armed group has intensified attacks against civilians in the country's eastern provinces and also expanded its actions beyond the areas in which it previously operated. The report issued today by the UN Joint Human Rights Office in the DRC shows how the human rights abuses committed by the ADF fighters have been systematic, brutal, and may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. The head of the UN mission in the DRC, Leila Zerougi, called on state authorities to step up efforts to complete pending judicial cases in all allegations of human rights violations and abuses, and to bring all alleged perpetrators to justice and ensure the right to truth, justice, reparations for the victims and their families. We also have an update from the Central African Republic following clashes last week between 3R insurgents and UN peacekeepers in the Ouampende prefecture. The mission has deployed additional peacekeepers to reinforce its capacities on the ground. This is part of the joint UN National Defense Forces operation against the 3R armed group in the country's northwest. The joint operation, named Alalondo, was launched on June 15th, aims to force the insurgents to leave the areas they've been occupying after last year's peace agreement. The operation also aims to improve the protection of civilians and to restore freedom of movement in the area. In response to threats issued over the weekend by Abbas Siddiqui, the leader of 3R, the head of the UN mission, Monker Ndiaye, warned that they will be held accountable if civilians are impacted by violence. Just a couple of things to update you that happened since we last briefed and we were last together. You must have seen on Thursday night we issued a note to correspondents informing you that we had that 2 male international staff members who are assigned to UNTSO in Jerusalem and who were in the UN vehicle in Tel Aviv have been identified as having engaged in misconduct, including conduct of a sexual nature. The 2 staff members have been placed on administrative leave without pay. The OIOS investigation continues and we'll keep you informed. Also, I want to read into the record the announcement we put out late last week on the appointment of Cristina Duarte of the Republic of Cabo Verde as the Special Advisor on Africa. She succeeds Jens Gawanas of Namibia, to whom the Secretary General is grateful for her commitment and dedicated service to the UN. Ms. Duarte brings to the position more than 34 years of leadership and strategic management experience in public policy making and in the private sector. More details on her biography online. And I'm delighted to thank our friends in Port-au-Prince for their full payment to the 2020 regular budget. That brings us up to 102 member states that have paid us in full for 2020. We still have a few to go, but 102 is a good number. And after we're done, and I won't hang up, my guests will be Inger Anderson, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program, and Jimmy Smith, the Director General of the International Livestock Research Institute, who will be launching the report Preventing the Next Pandemic, Zoonotic Diseases and How to Break the Chain of Transmission. And after that, Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS, will be here to discuss the launch of the annual UNAIDS Global AIDS Update Report. Tomorrow, my guest will be Liu Zenim, the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. He will be joined by Francesca Perucci, the Chief of DESA Statistical Service Branch, and Yoongi Min, the Chief of the Sustainable Development Goals Monitoring Section. They will discuss the key findings of the 2020 Sustainable Development Goals Report, which should be launched tomorrow on the opening day of the high-level political forum on sustainable development. Enough from me. I would be delighted to hear from you. Let me get the chat function up and everything else that I need. And Edie and then Ali has a question. So let's go to Miss Letter. Edie, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Steph. I hope everybody had a wonderful weekend. My question is about Libya. As I'm sure you know, the airbase in Tripoli that was taken by Turkey last month was bombed. I wonder what is Ms. Williams doing about trying to arrange talks with the parties?
Well, she is continuing her contact with the parties, and our basic message remains the same, is that we encourage all Libyans to swiftly find an agreement on the lasting ceasefire. I mean, as if we needed to reiterate, but we will reiterate that there is no military solution to the crisis in Libya. Both sides of this conflict need to abide by all relevant Security Council resolutions, as well as the conclusion of the Berlin conference. Now, obviously, we're concerned by the reports attacks on the base. From what we understand, carried out by unidentified foreign aircraft, which, again, we should not need to, but we need to remind all the parties to respect the arms embargo. And this violence, this new attack comes at a time of, I think what we've seen is heightened rhetoric by some Libyan and international actors, which I think could only inflame the situation and lead to further military escalation, and with the devastating impact that could have and may have on the Libyan civilians. Mr. Barada.
Is on Lebanon. The country financial and economic situation seems to be spiraling out of control to the point where people are talking about the risk of violence and even war. This is the one part I want to know, whether the United Nations has been doing anything to help Lebanon avert this destiny. And the other question is in relation to the continued Israeli violations to the Lebanese airspace. I know the official line from the United Nations and from the Secretary General, but now the Lebanese airspace has been used by the Israeli aircraft to attack Iranians or Syrian positions, or even Hezbollah positions in Syria. So is there any effort by the United Nations to also stop this kind of conduct by the Israelis?
Look, on your last part, I have nothing new to report. We've reported air violations regularly to the Security Council. It is, of course, imperative that Lebanon's territorial integrity be respected, including its airspace. On your first question about Lebanon, we don't believe that will be its destiny. Mr. Kubish has been very closely engaged with the Lebanese authorities and its international partners through the Lebanon Support Group to promote the implementation of necessary reforms. And those reforms need to be put in place quickly to meet the needs of the Lebanese people. It is critical that violence be avoided, that people's right to demonstrate peacefully be respected. Authorities, everyone needs to protect that right. For the Secretary General, he has a very simple and basic message to the Lebanese people, and that is one of solidarity with the people of Lebanon, as well as our advocacy for strong support for Lebanon from its international partners during what are clearly very difficult times. Okay, Iftikhar, please, you have a question. Iftikhar? I can't hear you.
Obviously, my question should be to WHO, but I'm asking whether the Secretary General has taken note of the statement issued by hundreds of scientists from 32 countries that this coronavirus disease is airborne, and this adds much dangerous element to the pandemic. You see, does the Secretary General has taken note of this letter from the?
Well, we have seen the press reports. Obviously, this is an issue for WHO to address, as they're in the lead on these issues. The Secretary General cannot speak to these scientific and medical issues. Dulcie, you have a question.
Topic. What are the nationalities of the officers who have been placed on leave without pay?
I don't have that information to release at this point. They are international staff members, civilian international staff members of the UN.
So have they been repatriated or?
No, the standard rule is that people who are put on special leave without pay are required to stay in the mission area for the purposes of the investigation while the investigation is ongoing. Once investigators feel they are no longer needed, there can be discussion about going back to their homes. Obviously, given the travel restrictions that are in place, that's something that may be complicated. But they are required to stay in the mission area while the investigation is ongoing and while the investigators need them there.
Thanks.
Okay. Abdelhamid and then Benny.
Thank you, Stéphane. I don't know if you are aware, there is a crisis going on now between Turkey, Russia, and even the United States about the famous Byzantine Hagia Sophia Museum, which was originally a church and turned into a mosque in 1453. Now Turkey is considering turning it back into a mosque rather than keep it as a museum. The U.S. issued a statement and Russia also issued a statement. Is the Secretary General aware of that? And also, is he aware that the La Mezquita in Cordoba was turned into a cathedral, which is almost the same time, that one 1453 and that one 1492. So,
when was it turned into a cathedral?
Or the La Mezquita, the mosque in Cordoba, the largest probably mosque in the world, was a cathedral was built into it. So the Turkey now is considering putting back Hagia Sophia as a mosque, and that is creating a crisis now. Is the SG aware of that?
I mean, I'm sure he's seen the press reports. I don't have anything to say at this point, but I will also check with our colleagues at UNESCO on this issue.
Thank you.
Okay. Benny Avni.
Stéphane, so what kind of misconduct are we talking about? I mean, was it just they were photographed, or is it using women prostitutes? Also, has it been determined who the woman photographed in the video is? Is she a UN employee?
There's not much more for me to say as the investigation is going on. They were suspended without pay based on the conversations and based on the evidence, which includes misconduct, including misconduct of a sexual nature. Obviously, as the investigation progresses, we'll have more details. The person, the woman who is seen in the video has, as far as I understand it, not yet been identified. But obviously, that investigation is ongoing.
So she's not a UN employee.
No, I think at this point we can say that she is not a UN staff member. Okay. On that note, before we go to our guests, any other questions? Okay, I don't see anybody waving madly or not madly. Okay, great.